you have people with wealth beyond anything we can imagine or comprehend who think that they're God, who think that they're above the law. That's a recipe for disaster. And this is the kind of thing, this is the kind of stuff that could very well be happening behind the scenes. All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Tat2d Preacher podcast. This is episode number 46. Hope you are all doing awesome. Today, in this episode, we're going to take a slight detour from what we've been looking at. It's going to be somewhat connected, just but slightly different in light of what's happening in the political world. In particular, U.S. politics. Now, I'm a Canadian, but U.S. politics does affect Canadians to a certain degree, and I find U.S. politics way more fascinating and interesting than Canadian politics. And the majority of people who follow me, whether it's TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, or even this podcast, is all from the U.S. So it's a very relevant and relatable subject that's affecting the majority of people that hear my stuff. So in light of all that, we're going to be looking at this question that's honestly been plaguing me, and I'm going to get into this in detail in a few minutes. But the question is, who is running the world? Who is actually running the world? In light of what we've just seen with the assassination attempt on Trump, and then you have this weird, mysterious COVID illness from Biden, and then he disappears, and then there's a sketchy resignation letter that he just posts on X, and nobody and his team even knew was coming out. And now all of a sudden you have this huge push for Kamala, I don't know how you say it, Harris, where she's the next greatest thing. Like something is off. And so as we've been looking at the last number of episodes, the idea of spiritual warfare and the fact that there are, number one, you have Satan himself as the prince of the power of the air. He's the god of this world, his agenda. But then you also have territorial principalities, demonic entities ruling nations, regions, towns, cities, areas. It's like, could there be something to that is actually impacting and influencing what we see happening in this current political climate? Because something's off. And when you start digging, you start looking into the occult, as we have been, but various branches of it, secret societies, people groups, various forms. And it's like, and the kind of things that the occult draws, kind of power and influence and all this stuff. It's just something's going on here. So that's where we're going in this episode. I want to just briefly share my thoughts on this stuff and just kind of have an open dialogue, processing that question, who is running the world? So if that interests you, this episode is for you. And as always, feel free. You can find me on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube. All the links to all of my various platforms are in the description below. And if you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or any other podcast platform, feel free to leave me a review. Just helps me, a good review, helps me get the podcast out there. Greatly appreciated. And yeah. Here we go, episode 46. Who is running the world? Sit back, relax, and enjoy the episode. All right, so now to set the stage here, just before we get into all the specifics that I just alluded to, I want to set the biblical stage, biblical foundation for the varying players in the unseen realm. And so if you've been following along the last number of episodes, this will be a bit of review. I'm going to add some new stuff, but I think this is so important. Understanding the kind of spiritual warfare that every single person alive is under, whether they realize it or not. And every nation, every people group, every ethnicity, it does not matter where you live. Spiritual warfare is happening, and it's all connected. And so I want to look at just the players that are out there and kind of how this happens just from a high level, because it's going to help us as we speculate and as we talk about some of the things that we're seeing, how it's connected, how it can be connected. And so this is why I'm super passionate about this, and it's super important to understand. So to set the stage here, I want to talk about something that I don't think I've really mentioned on this podcast, and it's the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. Now, that phrase is coined by the late Dr. Michael Heiser. He's where I got this information from. He's put a lot of this stuff on the map for so many Christians, so many scholars, so many theologians. So that's where I get that phrase from. But basically, and it's gonna connect with where we ended off last week with Ephesians chapter 6 and Daniel 10. It's all connected, but this is kind of where I want to start today. So Deuteronomy 32 verses 8 and 9 says this. It says, when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, he separated the sons of mankind. He set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. For the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is the allotment of his inheritance. And so it says, when the Most High gave the nations and he separated them according to the number of the sons of God, he fixed these boundaries. When did God separate the nations? When did that happen? Well, that happened at Babel. And so a lot of the story of Babel that doesn't necessarily get talked about a lot is right here. Is when you read Genesis chapter, I believe Genesis chapter 10 or 11, it talks about Babel. You often see the familiar narrative. God told the people, multiply, spread, fill the whole earth, subdue it, and they all congregate together in one area, the plains of Shinar. Then they build this tower, this temple, this ziggurat, and basically God sees what they're doing. He comes down and he says, all right, enough is enough. Y'all are not listening to me. And again, what was happening at Babel is a whole other story in and of itself. But God comes down, shuts down the mission. And then what does he do? He confuses their languages. And then all the nations then disperse. Now, what we see in Deuteronomy 32 is that each one of those nations, God places a son of God to watch over that nation. Because God says, all right, you know what? All these people, they're not listening to me. I'm going to remove myself from them for a time, and I'm going to start again. And this is why in Genesis chapter 12, we see he calls Abraham. And then that's when the nation of Israel begins. That's the beginning point, and that's where it says in Deuteronomy 32, Jacob is his allotment, his inheritance. And so then all these other nations, for a time, while God is establishing his people, the nation of Israel, all these other nations are ruled and governed by sons of God, divine beings that he put in charge. And so they were supposed to rule justly, govern them justly, rule them just as if God was ruling them himself for a time. But what happens is we see in Psalm 82 where these sons of God who were supposed to rule on God's behalf, well, they became corrupt and they began to receive worship for themselves. This is where you get all of the ancient gods from all the different civilizations. This is where they come from, right here. All the pantheons of all the civilizations from way back when, all the way up till we get to the New Testament and Rome, all of them. This is where it stems from. The gods of the nations begin to receive worship from the people that were supposed to be governing on God's behalf. And so Psalm 82 talks about God's judgment of these sons of God, and he judges them. So go check out Psalm 82. So the big idea, though, is every nation was assigned divine entities to govern them. And that's still in play today. How do I know that? Well, first we have Daniel chapter 10. So we talked about this last episode, where you have the prince of Persia fighting the archangel Michael. And so in the story in Daniel 10, Daniel prays this prayer, and for 21 days, he's waiting for this prayer to be answered, and he's struggling. It's difficult. It's tough. And then 21 days later, this angel shows up and says, Daniel, as soon as you set your heart to pray, God sent me to give you the answer, but I was held. I was withheld by the prince of Persia, a divine entity, demonic entity, and there was a battle taking place. And then the angel tells Daniel, I even had to get Michael to come help me because I couldn't take him on my own. So you have this cosmic battle that's taking place in the heavenlies. That prince of Persia, this is one of the sons of God from Deuteronomy 32, when God separated the nations. Over each nation was ruling entities. Prince of Persia, there was a battle. And so you have Michael, who was over Israel, and then you had the prince of Persia, who was, of course, over Persia. So you have this idea. Nations have their own entities ruling them, and there's cosmic warfare. And we saw that last week. And then you get to Ephesians chapter 6, where Paul talks about principalities, powers, rulers, authorities in heavenly places. This is New Testament language for describing the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. We're over nations, over regions, over cities, over large geographical areas. There are ruling entities at play that have direct influence in the lives, in the lives of the humans living within those domains. And so this is why all over the world, there are certain countries, there are certain cities, there are certain geographical areas that are more where the veil, if you will, is thinner, where there's a lot more occultic, satanic, demonic, supernatural events that take place, where people act, behave, are influenced in just certain ways more so than other parts. Why? Because those entities, those governing demonic entities have such a stronghold, such an influence in those regions. And so this is the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. This is Ephesians 6. And so right now, over every nation and over regions and areas, again, it's important to understand. That's why Paul says we don't struggle, we don't battle, we don't fight against flesh and blood, but against what? These rulers, authorities, principalities, forces of darkness in heavenly places. Why? Because they're the ones that are influencing people in their domains. So that's important to understand, that in our everyday lives, when we see in the political sphere, or whenever there's conflict, whenever things are happening, things are out of control, whenever we see things like in the education system, like all of these things, when we see things go haywire, we're not fighting against people. Because these people, we're fighting against, we're coming up against the entities that are behind them, that are influencing them. So that's why as Christians, we're supposed to be influenced by the Holy Spirit, by God himself. And if you are not in Christ, then that means you are in the kingdom of darkness, and you're being influenced by so many other forces that you may not even realize. And so this is the spiritual battle that we are all in. And there's regions and areas that are under the influence of demonic entities. So that's the biblical foundation that I want to just to quickly establish now as we get into this stuff, as we think about this stuff. Because we're not just looking at human versus human. It's not just people. We're not just fighting against or talking about corrupt government. We are dealing with things that are happening in the cosmic realm, the unseen realm, that are directly influencing things we're seeing take place in time and space. So that is the biblical foundation that I wanted to establish. Okay, so now jumping in a little bit deeper, what really got me going on this question of who's running the world, who's ruling things, like who's actually running the show. I heard part of an interview with a guy by the name of Patrick Bet-David. He's got a massive podcast, huge following, and I saw this part of this interview where he was asked this question: who rules the world? And so he kind of pauses and thinks about it, and then he starts processing his answer out loud. And he's thinking to himself, he's like, well, could it be politicians? The president? Is it prime ministers? President of the US, the leader of the free world? Is it the banks? Is it big pharma? Is it investors? Is it the billionaires, global elites, secret societies? Like he's like, you know what? All of these options could be viable. But he said, basically, to answer that question, you have to follow the money. You got to follow the money. And he was basically stating how the billionaire elites around the world, the people that are just multi-billionaires, who have their hands in, the political sphere, the medical sphere, the educational sphere, who donate truckloads of money to these various companies, institutions. He said, this is where you have to, this is where following the money is a good start to figure out who's pulling the strings behind the scene. And I heard that, and I'm listening to it, and my mind just starts, just going through the recent events in light of that. Because this interview, this was a while ago. It wasn't recent. And when you look at the recent events, and then you put it together with certain conspiracy theories that are out there, where you have this, it's a very common conspiracy theory, where you have this global elite committee, this cabal of billionaires, some that we know the names of. For example, you have the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, Soros, Bill Gates, these guys, etc. But then there's also a bunch of unnamed billionaires who the public will never know who they are, but they are at the top of the list, if you will. And that kind of conspiracy theory viewpoint it's been out there for forever now. And so you put that together with this of what's been happening, and to me, it just seems like something's going on. And I don't think it's conspiracy. A lot of people don't think it's conspiracy, but the fact that, could it be that this global elite committee, whatever they are, whatever their name is, whoever is on that list, but they are the ones who have all the money, and they're the ones that are known to, it's been suggested that they are the ones who are pulling the strings. So for example, in elections, they want certain candidates in place. They want someone to win, not to win, whatever. Money talks. So Patrick Bet-David was basically saying. But if you think about let's just go through quickly just these events. You have the takeout of Trump. And so the whole scenario around this was just so bizarre. They knew that there was some dude on the roof well before Trump even took the stage, and they didn't do anything about it. And then there's reports that the FBI director or the one who's in charge of the Secret Service didn't want any of her men going up on the roof because it was too sloped. And so they knew about the sniper. She didn't send any extra help out there to get this guy because it was too dangerous. Then you see all of this footage minutes before, as he's speaking, people are pointing to cops and to law enforcement. Hey, there's a dude on the roof. And then you have the snipers who saw the guy lying there with his rifle, didn't do anything. And then all of a sudden, then there was the shooting, and then there was the chaos and the aftermath where you have these agents, and we saw the videos of it, who they look like they don't have no idea what they're doing. They can't even holster their guns properly. And you're just like, what is going on? Like, clearly, this wasn't a random event. I mean, clearly it was staged. And so you're thinking, like, are they that obvious? Like, so it's not unreasonable to look at that and be like, okay, well, something's definitely going on here. Who's behind it? And of course, the immediate answer is you have, the left, the controlling elites who always are leaning more to the left. But then you think that, and then you see what's happened with Biden. Now, I've always been against Biden. I don't think that dude's a good dude at all. There's just so much garbage and stuff that's associated with him. But you see what happened with him, where he gets this mysterious COVID illness, and then he disappears. And then people are wondering, like, is he dead? Is he not dead? Like, what's going on? There was stuff that was happening in Vegas with going to the hospital there or something. And it was just, there's all this confusion. And then the infamous resignation letter where he posts on X with some forged signature, and it wasn't even on official presidential paper. There was no seal on it. His team didn't even know what was happening until after it did. And it's like, what president would ever do that, has ever done that? It was just something that was so bizarre. And then you see all of these messages from like Obama and like other big name members in parliament, celebrities, with these cryptic memorial like messages to want to thank, Biden. He's one of the most consequential presidents in history. And it was like all of these messages that were just like what you would say at a memorial service, or if he had died, someone's passed on, and then people are just, remembering them. It was really bizarre, all these messages. And then you have this push for Kamala Harris, and where all of a sudden she's now the next greatest thing in the world, and she's being championed and pushed, and she's got rallies and all this stuff. And then you have a lot of people speculating, well, this is clearly the same group that's behind taking Trump out, basically forced Biden out of his office himself, if not unalived him. So it's just so many strange, weird things happening that just don't add up. And so whatever global elite system, they have an agenda, and it's like they wanted Trump out, then they wanted Biden out. Okay, because then today, and I'm recording this July 25th, I think last night, July 24th, Biden addresses the nation. He walks out of the White House, and there's so many videos. Like, I posted a video about this where you're like, is this even him? It looks like he's taller. He's walking completely fine, perfect mobility. And it's like so many people think this dude, it's a mask, or it's not really him. It's a clone. It's an actor dressed up as him. Like, so many different theories, but you're just like, something is going on here. Something is not right. And so you sit back and ask yourself the question, who's running the show? Who's running the show? Who's behind the scenes pulling the strings? Who sets the agenda by which things follow? I mean, politics have been corrupt for so long. And so it's not new information. It's not a new thought or a new idea that there is a secret agenda out there. But like, who's running it? So to kind of further go down this road of figuring out who's running the show, I came across this article. It was written by a writer by the name of Rachel Ehrenfeld and Sean McCumber from 2004, October 4th, 2004, where they're doing a write-up on George Soros. So George Soros is a extremely, extremely wealthy philanthropist, business dude, investor. A lot of conspiracy stuff surrounding George Soros. I'm not going to go into all of that in this podcast, but it goes on to talk about how back in 2004, during the George Bush and John Kerry political competition, where Bush ended up beating out Kerry. But it goes on to say how Soros, was spending, at that point, he was spending more than $15 million of his own money to get John Kerry elected. He's like, he didn't want Bush. He says in this article, the article is actually entitled George Soros, the God Who Carries Around Some Dangerous Demons. That's the name of the article. But he says that, Bush is a danger to the world. And so to prevent him from getting reelected at this point, he's dedicated extraordinary amounts of time and money to helping Kerry defeat Bush, which ultimately didn't happen. But what's interesting about this is, number one, is you see that there are wealthy men or wealthy individuals who pump money into the political world so that certain people can get elected or have a greater advantage of getting elected. So that's the first thing. But what he goes on to say is extremely weird. So the writer, quote, it says, "It seems that Soros believes he was anointed by God." And this is what Soros goes on to say, quote, "I fancied myself as some kind of God. If truth be known, I carried some rather potent messianic fantasies with me from childhood, which I felt I had to control, otherwise they might get me in trouble," end quote. And so the article goes on to say, when asked by Britain's independent newspaper to elaborate on that passage, Soros said, quote, "It is a sort of disease when you consider yourself some kind of God, the creator of everything. But I feel comfortable about it now since I began to live it out," end quote. So you got this dude, George Soros, with a crazy God complex where he admits that he's got messianic, or that he's had messianic fantasies since childhood, where he views himself as being anointed by God to be a God. Super, super bizarre. Then later in the article, Soros is now talking about his book. He wrote a book called Soros on Soros. And in the book, he says, quote, "I do not accept the rules imposed by others." And so the writer then goes on to say, clearly Soros considers himself to be someone who's able to determine when the normal rules should apply and shouldn't apply. And so you have this guy who basically says, I'm rich, I'm wealthy, I view myself as a god, I abide by my own rules. No one passes laws on me, no one passes rules on me. I decide when rules should and shouldn't apply. We have this same guy thinking he's God, the same guy who, gives bucket loads of money in various elections. And this was 2004. And so put that into today's perspective. I mean, he's one guy of who knows how many who funnel millions of dollars into these elections so that certain people get or not get elected. People who think themselves as divine. People who think that they're above the law. And this is what I'm talking about. This global elite system, this committee of billionaires, wealthy people who have an agenda, who think that they're above the law, who basically run the show behind. And again, this is such a massive topic. I'm just not even scratching the surface. This is just one little example of the men and corporations and people behind the scenes who are funneling millions and billions of dollars into various projects on a global scale. But in particular here, because we're talking about U.S. politics, into the political world. Not just people who, desire a certain person to win or not win. It's not just that, but it's more bizarre and deeper than that, where these people who are clearly a little bit jacked up in their thinking, where they have some God complex. So you have wealth, you have people with wealth beyond anything we can imagine or comprehend, who think that they're God, who think that they're above the law. That's a recipe for disaster. And this is the kind of thing, this is the kind of stuff that could very well be happening behind the scenes. And so when you take a step back and you look at what's happening right now with Trump, and what's even happening with Biden, where he's basically forced, well, who's pulling those strings behind the scene? It's guys like Soros. It's other billionaires who are using their money, using their influence to promote whatever agenda that they deem they want to promote. And so to me, I saw that, and it was mind blowing how they're not even hiding it. Like this is an article that was written saying where he was interviewed. It's like, it's crazy. But when you see that, you're just like, who's running the world? Huh. To me, things just start making just a little bit more sense. And so now, connecting this back to kind of where we started this episode, with looking at the various players on the biblical stage, where we looked at the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, and we looked at the fact that there are nations and areas and cities and regions that are influenced by demonic entities, by those principalities and powers and rulers that have been put there. It's like when you can see with guys like Soros, guys like the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, you look at these names and these people and these individuals and these groups, and you see the kind of stuff that they're about, the way that they think about themselves. You kind of see the kind of things that they push out or desire to push out. And it's like, if that's not evidence that there is supernatural influence happening, I don't know what is. Like, these men, these groups, these societies, whatever this group of elites are, they're not just a bunch of humans who just happen to get together and think this way and feel this way and you know, have just like mind, and it's like it's so much bigger than that. This is where I believe, and from my little research and study into this, what I believe is, like, man, this is where the occult has a massive play in its various forms, where you have these men, these families, these groups, they're heavily engaged in satanic stuff. And this is where a lot of that power and influence and control and stuff comes from. And again, this is a massive, an absolutely massive topic, massive subject that you could spend literally hundreds of hours going through. But this is just one small example of how this plays out, of how the battle in the unseen realm, that there's a cosmic battle between the kingdom of darkness and the kingdom of God, but also how those rulers in heavenly places over nations, over regions, over geographical areas, partner with humans, and humans partner with them to promote, to push out whatever the number one main satanic agenda is from Satan himself. And I think that there's just so much more behind the scenes than we know, than we realize. But this is why discernment has to be at an all-time high for Christians, for people in general. Why we can't just turn a blind eye to things, why we can't just swallow and eat up mainstream narrative, because so often it's just nonsense. And this is why it's like, this is why I'm talking about this stuff. And I'm so limited in my understanding of all of this. I'm just beginning to jump into this world and to really try to learn and see what's there. But this is why I'm even wanting to do this myself, because as a Christian, as someone who's been involved in ministry, someone who loves the church, I think just so many Christians are so incredibly just uninformed with the kind of things that happen in our world. I think it's so easy to get caught up in our Christian lives, our comfortable lives, just, where they just remain completely oblivious to the spiritual war that's taking place and the hugeness of that spiritual war. It's not just about fighting sin, trying to not do bad things and trying to be better and be more loving to people. And it's so much more just massive. And that's what I'm discovering. And it's like, you sound like a crazy conspiracy theorist person sometimes. I mean, I've been called a lot of those names recently on my various social media platforms, but I honestly, I don't even care. I just want the truth, and I want the church to understand the truth, and I want the gift of discernment to be at an all-time high in the church, and be able to look at events that are happening in time and space and reality right now, but to not just get caught up in the mainstream narrative of it, but actually see, hey, behind the scenes stuff is going on here that doesn't make sense. And it goes deeper and more dark and more evil and more sinister than I think we understand. And I think that's what I want to get out, is I want to break the paradigm of so many people, so many Christians, just to be able to hear and entertain things that you don't hear in church. And so that's kind of what I want to get out of this episode. I hope it made sense. Again, I'm still looking into this stuff myself. I'm still learning. I'm just barely even scratching the surface. I just know that that spiritual warfare is real, and it's so much bigger and more intense than we realize. And when you look at the supernatural worldview of the Bible, as we've been doing over the last number of episodes, and then you look at our modern world and you see the stuff that's happening, it's stuff that's happening in the unseen realm is mirrored by what's happening on the earth. They're connected. And there's a war happening up there, there's a war happening down here. I just want truth to be seen, and I want this illusion that the typical naive Christian illusion of life to just be smashed, because it's not what people think it is. In politics, and this is just one small example of that, where you can look at what's happening, and you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to look at what's happening and be like, something is off here. Something doesn't make sense. There's something going on, and that's the point that I want to drive home. So thanks so much for listening and or watching. Feel free to leave any questions, comments in the comment section below. Let's engage. Let me know what you think. Let me know what your thoughts are on this whole thing. And we'll see you all in the next episode. Much love and God bless.